Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first of two lectures given by Professor Derek Jonathan Penslar. In Hebrew, just Jonathan Penslar. He explained to me a few minutes ago that his name was seen in Hebrew words, people would mispronounce the Derek as you would figure out yourself. So in Hebrew, Jonathan Penslar. I'm very happy to introduce him, and I'll introduce him more fully in a few minutes. The title of his lecture today is Anti-Semitism and Zionism, Ideology or Emotions, Anti-Semitism with a hyphen. I participated this summer in a workshop on anti-Semitism, and there was a significant discussion whether anti-Semitism should be written with a hyphen or without a hyphen. So today we will hear the lecture about anti-Semitism with a hyphen. But before we move to the main lecture and to the introduction of our guest, Professor Motti Golani, the chair of the Department of Jewish History, will say a few words. So Motti, please.
ערב טוב. כיוון שאני מאמין שהיסטוריון חוקר הוא איש שחייב להיות גם קצת חתרני, וכיוון שדרק מדבר מצוין עברית, סליחה שאני חושף את זה, אז אני אפתח בעברית כי אנחנו באוניברסיטת תל אביב, וההרצאה תהיה באנגלית והדיון יהיה אחר כך באנגלית, ומי שרוצה לשאול שאלה בעברית יכול לעשות את זה, ודרק יענה באנגלית, זה בסדר. אנטישמיות וציונות, האם זה אידיאולוגיה, האם זה רגש? על זה ידבר דרק עוד מעט. אני סיימתי עכשיו ספר גדול, הביוגרפיה של אחד חיים ויצמן. חיים ויצמן, לא עזר ויצמן, היה רוב הקריירה שלו משה שהוליך את התנועה הציונית במדבר מהחזון של הרצל עד למימוש בראשות בן גוריון. ואצלו הציונות הייתה גם אידיאולוגיה, כנראה, בוודאי רגש. יש שתי אמירות של ויצמן שלא בטוח שהוא אמר אותם, אבל מיוחסות לו. אין לי מראה מקום. לא צריך להיות משוגע כדי להיות ציוני, אבל זה עוזר. ואחר כך הוא הוסיף משהו שמתכתב נפלא עם אנטישמיות, היהודים הם כמו זבל. כשאתה מפזר אותם בעולם, הם מפרים אותו. כשכולם ביחד, זה מסריח. חיים ויצמן, נשיא ההסתדרות הציונית העולמית. כלומר, הציוני האולטימטיבי, חיים ויצמן, שילב גם בציונות שלו, גם במעשה הפוליטי שלו, הרבה רגש, שימוש אינטנסיבי ומודע באנטישמיות, אני מניח שדרק ייגע בעניין הזה, ואם אתה לא מכיר את ויצמן לפני ולפנים, אתה משוכנע שהאיש הוביל תנועה שכולה הייתה רגש. מה גם? שכאשר אתה הולך על המספרים, מסתבר לך שרוב האנשים היהודים שהיגרו לארץ, בוודאי מראשית המאה ה-20 ועוד יותר אחרי מלחמת העולם הראשונה, הגיעו לכאן מסיבות שהרגש לא היה המרכזי שבהם. סיבות כלכליות, סיבות של סכנת נפשות, גם אידיאולוגיה לא הייתה שם מי יודע מה. כלומר, רגש יש אצל המנהיגים אולי, השאלה אם נמצא בשטח, אידיאולוגיה, שאלה גדולה. ואני רוצה לומר בעניין הזה דבר שכדי לא לקחת את דרק את העבודה, מתכתב דווקא ממנו כדי שתבינו את ההיבט האידיאולוגי המסובך של הציונות. ציונות היא אידיאולוגיה ללא ספק, אבל אידיאולוגיה תלוית הקשר. כאשר אתה מסתכל למשל היום על המושג ציונות, בלי לנקוט עמדה פוליטית, אתה יכול להיות ציוני היום מהסוג הלאומי דתי ולהכריז על עצמך בראש חוצות שאתה הציוני האולטימטיבי, ושבעצם הציונות של אנשים אחרים שהם לא דתיים, שהם שמאל רחמנא ליצלן, זה בכלל על סף בגידה, בוודאי אנטי ציונות, בעוד שאחרים יביטו על אותם ציונים דתיים ככישלון המהדהד של הרעיון הציוני. אלה ואלה יטענו שהם ציונים. כלומר, צריך לבדוק, אם אני חוזר עכשיו אל ההיסטוריה, את הרעיון הציוני ואת הפגישה שלו עם המימוש על רקע ההקשר ההיסטורי. הוא הדבר המכריע. ואז אנחנו נראה שהאידיאולוגיה הציונית, וזה גם כוחה, הייתה גמישה מאוד ותלוית הקשר. לא הרי האידיאולוגיה הציונית של הרצל, כהרי האידיאולוגיה הציונית של ויצמן, בן גוריון אחריו ואחרים. שלא לדבר על ז'בוטינסקי. כשאתה בודק כל אחד מהם בנפרד, נראה לך שבעצם הציונות היא שורה של אידיאולוגיות, שמה שמחבר אותם הוא בעיקר הרצון העקרוני להקים בית לאומי, אפילו לא מדינה, בארץ ישראל. אולי המחלוקת העיקרית הייתה מחלוקת לכאורה אופרטיבית, אבל יש גם בה המון מהאידיאולוגיה, ואני לא מדבר על המחלוקת הידועה בין אחד העם לציונים המעשיים, אני מדבר אפילו על המחלוקת של שנות ה-30 וה-40 עד השואה. האם יוקם כאן בית לאומי ואחריו מדינה כתוצאה מהתנאים שיווצרו כאן, ואז יגיעו לכאן אנשים, או שקודם ניצור כאן תנאים מיטביים, נביא הרבה אנשים, ואז יקומו בית לאומי או מדינה. כלומר, זה הוויכוח בין גורם מחולל לבין תוצאה. דבר והיפוכו. זה לכאורה משהו פרגמטי, יש כאן המון אידיאולוגיה. וכאן אני חוזר אל הרגש. ואני רוצה לטעון, ואולי דרק לא יסכים, שבסופו של דבר, מזלו של העניין הציוני, שהוא לא היה תלוי רגש, בסופו של דבר, אלא הוא היה עניין פרגמטי לעילה ולעילה. שאחרת קשה להסביר איך 30 שנה אחרי הצהרת בלפור קמה מדינת ישראל, הרף עין היסטורי ללא ספק, 30 שנה בלבד, ואני לא קונה שזה בגלל השואה, זה למרות השואה, ולכן צריך לבדוק את העניין הזה בצורה מושכלת ולחזור אל אידיאולוגיה גמישה תלוית קונטקסט ואל רגש שהוא תמיד מוגבל, שהוא תמיד בשליטה. אלה שאיבדו את הקונטרול על הרגש היו בשוליים, כן, של אנשי גדוד העבודה שחזרו לברית המועצות, או מהצד השני התופעות הקיקיוניות של אצ"ל ולח"י, אבל המיינסטרים הציוני, שמאל, מרכז וימין, היה כל הזמן בשליטה אמוציונלית, ובסופו של דבר הם הסכימו לקבל את החסות הבריטית, שהרי בלעדי זה אי אפשר היה להקים מדינה, ואני אסיים רק בעניין הזה. אם נלך רק על הרגש, ואם נלמד ציונות לפי חסמבה של יגאל מוסינזון, וזה בעצם מה ששולט בזיכרון ההיסטורי, הרי בעצם הייתה כאן מלחמה נגד ערבים שרוצים לזרוק את הציונים לים, ונגד התופעה הרעה של הבריטים שהם בכלל כמובן אנטי ציונים גמורים. ולא היא. הציונות כפרויקט שהצליח להפוך את הדפקט לאפקט, תסלחו לי על הביטוי, כלומר את החולשה ליתרון, זה היה פרויקט שהבין שצריך לקחת את הבריטים כפרויקט של חממה, לחסות בצילם, להתווכח איתם, אפילו ויכוח מר, וזה פרויקט שהרגש ממנו והלאה. וזה נכון לגבי ויצמן, שלא היה פילו בריטי, הוא היה בריטי, זה נכון לגבי הפילו הבריטי הגדול ביותר של התנועה הציונית, אני מתכוון לז'בוטינסקי, וגם תנועת העבודה שבלעה את הרוק ואמרה, עם זה אנחנו הולכים. כלומר, ההבנה שהבריטים הם הדבר, כלומר, זו דוגמה מצוינת ליכולת לשלוט ברגש, כי כי אחרת היינו מנהלים הם היו מנהלים את העשייה שלהם כמו שאנחנו מנהלים היום את הזיכרון. כלומר, שמים במרכז את השאלה מי גירש את הבריטים ואת ההפלה ושאר שאלות נפלאות שהן לא היו העניין המרכזי בזמן אמת. ולכן אני באמת לא יודע אם הציונות היא רגש או אידיאולוגיה, אני יודע מה שלט במה, ולא נגעתי באנטישמיות מן הטעם הפשוט שזה בעיניי, ומעניין מה דרק יגיד בעניין הזה, זה בעיניי נושא אקטואלי בצורה כואבת. אני רק אומר בקצרה כדי לא, גם כי אין לי זמן וגם כדי לא להיסחף לאמירות אקטואליות יותר על המידה, העובדה שאנחנו לא מצליחים להבדיל היום, וגם לא תמיד מעבר צריך לומר, בין ביקורת על המפעל הציוני, ביקורת על מפעל, על מדינת ישראל, לבין אנטישמיות. אגב, העירוב הזה קיים. יכול להיות אנטישמי שיבקר את מדינת ישראל או את הפרויקט הציוני, אבל יכול להיות גם לא. אלא שהשמחה המשונה הזאת, שבה אנחנו מאמצים או מעבירים כל ביקורת על הפרויקט הציוני ועל ישראל אל האגף של האנטישמיות, זה דבר מעניין שצריך לחשוב עליו. צריך לחשוב עליו חשיבה מחודשת, ואני לא יודע אם זה ירגיע אתכם, בתור היסטוריון של תקופת המנדט אין חדש. זאת אומרת, זה לא שאנחנו המצאנו את זה, זה היה קיים גם באותם שנים, אם כי אני חייב לומר או לא חייב, אני רוצה, שמח לומר, לפחות שההנהגה באותה תקופה, על כל אגפיה, שמאל, ימין ומרכז, השתדלה ככל יכולתה להבדיל בין אנטישמיות לבין ביקורת. אני מאוד שמח שדרק פה, אני חושב שזו הזדמנות נהדרת לשמוע חוקר מוביל שמסתכל על המקרה היהודי, הציוני, כולל היישובי, במבט רחב של מי שיושב בחוץ. אני חושב שזו הזדמנות נפלאה לשמוע גישה אחרת. טוב שאתה כאן. תודה.
Okay, I'll introduce our speaker and thank you, Motti, for the introductory remarks. Professor Derek Penslar is the William Lee Frost Professor of Modern Jewish History at Harvard. His work encompasses the history of the Jews in modern Western and Central Europe, North America, and Israel. He has taught at the Indiana University Bloomington, at the University of Toronto, at Oxford University, where he served as the inaugural Stanley Lewis Professor of Modern Israeli Studies from 2012 to 2016. He co-edits with Anita Shapira the Journal of Israeli History, and he's a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada and the President of the American Academy of Jewish Research. His most recent books are The Origins of the State of Israel, 1882 to 1948, a documentary history with Eran Kaplan, Jews and the Military, a history, and Theodore Herzl, the Charismatic Leader, which is forthcoming with Yale University Press very soon, I imagine. He's currently writing a book entitled Zionism An Emotional State for Rutgers University Press, and he will talk about some of these issues today in his lectures. Professor Penslar, please.
I'd rather stand than sit simply because you're less likely to fall asleep. There's done psychological studies of this, that people are less likely to fall asleep when someone is standing than if someone is sitting. If there were just something just something like, or some books. Remember books is what people had before the internet? There was these things called books. Or if it's a nice, yeah, that might be. It's a nice one. Where'd you get it? It's very good. Oh, thank you. I'll take it home. All right, this might work. This might work. Thank you. So let's see. Okay. Now then it'll just fall off. All right. So again, thank you to all, and thank you for your tolerance in allowing me to lecture in in English. I could lecture in Hebrew, but then what would happen is after about 5 minutes, several of you in the audience would start to scream corrections of my Hebrew. So I'll stay with English. So the paper I'm going to present represents a transition between the project I've just completed and the one that I am beginning. The former was a biography of Theodor Herzl for Yale University Press's Jewish Lives series, and the latter, as Iris said, is a book titled Zionism, An Emotional State for Rutgers University Press's Keywords in Jewish Studies series. The new project, which I've just started on in the last few months, will argue that Zionism, which is usually studied as an idea or as a political movement, is better understood within an emotional matrix. The book will center around dyads of overlapping and yet distinct emotions, such as love and devotion, gratitude and pride, guilt and shame, fear and anxiety, and hatred and rage. I've written an article on Zionist feelings of gratitude towards the great powers, especially Britain, during the movement's early decades. And in the paper below, I'm going to make a case for an emotional historical approach to Zionism. I will define the terms that inform my study, and then I'm going to apply the emotional term to Herzl, and also I'm going to dare to try to apply it to Chaim Weizmann, knowing that we have one of the world's greatest experts on Weizmann right here in the room. And I'm going to then relate the Zionist worldviews of Herzl and Weizmann to the general question of the relationship between Zionism and anti-Semitism, which in many ways are, to quote Joseph Conrad, secret sharers. All right, we are accustomed to define nationalism as an ideology, or as a means of identification. But I would propose, however, that we conceive of nationalism as a form of emotional self-medication. Its narrative of a sempiternal community offers, if not a cure, then at least a tonic to allay the fear of death. The notion that one does belong to a certain nation, and that others do not, both enables and provides shelter from social marginalization or exclusion, which scholars have tellingly called social death. The nationalist idea provides justification and rationalization for feelings such as resentment, hatred, anger, loneliness, anxiety, guilt, and shame. Last but not least, nationalism is the continuation of eros by other means. It both co-opts and supplants the romantic love that joins humans into long-lasting pair bonds and makes possible the continuation of the species. These emotionally therapeutic qualities of nationalism are readily apparent in Zionism. Like other forms of nationalism, Zionism employs ideology to sustain an emotional community united by negative emotions as well as positive ones, such as hope, love, and pride. Zionism's emotional register has been deeply influenced by the presence, absence, and nature of ambient anti-Semitism. Like other forms of racism, anti-Semitism provides an ideological veneer for emotions, such as fear, resentment, despair, and shame. And this evening I wish to explore the interaction between two powerful emotional forces, Zionism and anti-Semitism, using as a case study Zionist diplomacy from the mid-1890s until the early 1920s. That is, from the outset of Theodor Herzl's brief but meteoric Zionist career to the wartime Zionist leadership of Chaim Weizmann, the issuing of the Balfour Declaration in 1917, and both Zionist and anti-Semitic reactions to this transformative event. Possessed of radically different personalities, operating under different geopolitical circumstances, Theodor Herzl elevated anti-Semitism into an ideology, while Chaim Weizmann engaged with it as an emotion. Conversely, at first anti-Semites saw in Zionism a source of emotional relief, but in the aftermath of World War I and the issuing of the Balfour Declaration, anti-Semites incorporated Zionism into an increasingly monolithic, ominous, and dangerous ideology. Now let me define my terms. I always tell my graduate students to define their terms, particularly the term neoliberal. I always tell them, what do you mean by neoliberalism? Well, let me begin by defining basic terms: ideology, emotion, and so on. By ideology, I mean a coherent and sustained interpretation of experience in terms of fundamental beliefs and values. Ideologies function via both deductive and inductive logic, first principles, and empirical observation. They lay claim to rationality, although in fact they need not be rational. This definition goes beyond Marxist or neo-Marxist conceptions of ideology as the belief system of dominant classes and reflective of their economic interests. It encompasses religion broadly understood, and all of the systematic political systems of late modernity, such as liberalism, communism, and fascism. By this rubric, both anti-Semitism and Zionism could be classified as ideologies, but an individual who defines herself, or who is defined by others as anti-Semitic or Zionist, does not necessarily structure her interpretive universe around either of these isms. That is, one could have an aversion to Jews without perceiving history as an eternal struggle between Jews and Gentiles. Similarly, one could feel an identification with or an attachment to the State of Israel without defining oneself exclusively in terms of Zionism. The term Zionist has often been employed as a pejorative, first in the Stalinist Soviet Union, and then throughout the Arab world, and more recently in leftist academic circles throughout the West. Conversely, the word anti-Semite has at times been brandished with pride, particularly in German-speaking Europe, from the 1880s to 1945. That said, for the past century, the word anti-Semite has usually been associated with opprobrium, to the point that in our own era, it is not uncommon for people who hate Jews to deny that they are anti-Semites. For this reason, it is far more likely that someone who explicitly calls himself an anti-Semite espouses a sustained, wide-ranging anti-Semitic ideology than that someone who calls himself a Zionist would in fact structure his life around commitment to the well-being of the State of Israel. That is, you can say you're a Zionist and you don't really have to explain yourself, at least outside of certain university circles in the Western world. You just say, I'm a Zionist. But if you say I'm an anti-Semite, you're making a real statement. And it's a statement very few people today, for example, would want to make. Ideology can have unconscious sources. It is not sealed off from feeling. This gets back to Motti's comments about the relationship between feeling and ideology. Going back to the days of Freud and William James, people have debated about the seat of emotions in the psyche or in the body, whether it is culturally constructed or common to all humans, and whether it is a hallmark of the primitive, which in the Western world was subdued via a civilizing process, or whether it is always present, but performed in changing ways. Talking about how emotion is performed, however, does not get us any closer to understanding what emotion is. What is emotion? One could define emotion as irrational or non-rational cognition and volition, but that definition doesn't work. We often justify our emotions in terms of both reality and logic. Besides, people can base logical argumentation on preposterous assumptions or draw conclusions from biased observations. It happens all the time. An emotion, then, is no more and no less rational than a concept or an idea. Moreover, both emotion and ideology are expressed through language, and the difference between the two is that emotion begins with an inchoate feeling, which is after the fact, at times milliseconds thereafter, expressed via language. Ideology, however, is encased in language, which then elicits emotional reactions. We only know what we are feeling once we have put it into words. But the words that we use and the actions we take as a result of those words vary greatly across time and space. So I suggest we abandon reference to rationality, and following the political scientist Roger Peterson, define emotion as psychological mechanisms that regulate the intensity and the salience of desire. I would embellish that definition by classifying negative emotions such as fear, resentment, hatred, rage, and jealousy as expressions of disequilibrium, unfulfilled desire, and positive emotions such as pride, contentment, and magnanimity as expressions of equilibrium, of having achieved certain desires, wants, needs. Love is the most liminal emotion, as it can indicate both fulfilled and unfulfilled desire. On this view, anti-Semitism is a verbalization of disequilibrium and unfulfilled desire, whereas Zionism combines aspects of disequilibrium and equilibrium, longing and fulfillment. Both anti-Semitism and Zionism are equally emotional in origin, but they draw upon varying emotional matrices. So that's the general analysis of emotion and ideology. And now let me relate it to Zionism, specifically Herzl and Weizmann. So let me start with Herzl. About the extent to which Herzl Zionism was in fact a product of anti-Semitism. This question is actually rather easy to answer, although my argument may appear counterintuitive. I do not believe that anti-Semitism does much to explain Herzl's turn to Zionism. The connection between anti-Semitism and the embrace of Zionism appears obvious. As a university student, later as a state attorney, Herzl endured disturbing anti-Semitic incidents. At the age of 22, he was badly shaken when he read Eugen Döring's splenetic anti-Semitic book, Die Judenfrage als Frage des Rassencharakters und seiner Schädlichkeit für Existenz und Kultur des Volkes. That is not one word in German, but it could be. The Jewish question is a question of racial character and its noxious effects upon the existence and the culture of peoples. Herzl did not, however, react in any sustained way to anti-Semitic slights until 1893. And rather than adopt Jewish nationalism, no, he fantasized about mass Jewish conversion to Catholicism or Jewish participation in a great socialist revolution that would put an end to the social injustice that he believed fed anti-Semitism. Herzl's growing Jewish self-awareness and self-pride were apparent in his most famous play, The New Ghetto of 1894, written shortly before, not after or during, but before, Alfred Dreyfus's first trial for espionage, which Herzl covered as Paris correspondent for the Neue Freie Presse. Simultaneous events in Vienna, where the anti-Semitic city councilor and Christian socialist Karl Lueger was elected mayor, although not seated until 1897, sent Herzl into a delirious state. And in 1895 he began to scribble in a diary a mixture of incoherent and brilliant thoughts that became the core of his pamphlet, The Jewish State. So it seems that anti-Semitism matters. But Herzl was hardly alone among Central European Jews in being exposed to anti-Semitism. The overwhelming majority of Central European Jews who were exposed to anti-Semitism in the late 1800s did not become Zionists. Anti-Semitism was a necessary but insufficient condition for his turn to Zionism. The other essential component was his own chronic state of psycho-emotional distress. Throughout his life, Herzl battled depression. He freely acknowledged that only success, theatrical, journalistic, or political, would bring him out of his funk. Although Herzl did establish some friendships, in general it was extremely difficult for him to establish close relations, especially romantic or erotic ones with others. Herzl's ability to form long-lasting, loving relationships was stunted by the death during his late teens of his sister Pauline and a young woman named Madeline Herz, the daughter of family friends on whom he had a schoolboy crush. Herzl never sustained an intimate, erotic relationship with an individual of either gender. As a young man, he had dalliances that left him physically disgusted by women and marred by gonorrhea. When he first met his future wife, Julie Naschauer, in 1886, erotic attraction elicited violent nausea and psychosomatic pain. Shortly after meeting Julie and being repelled by his attraction to her, Herzl developed an infatuation with none other than the 14-year-old niece of the late Madeline Herz. Intriguingly, in that same year, Herzl published his first book of journalistic essays known as Feuilleton, News from Venus, in which Venus is associated with what is distant and unattainable, that which is enticing from afar but loathsome when encountered up close. One of the most revealing stories in the collection is about a man who can read others' thoughts. It goes on at length about the ease with which innocence can turn to corruption. Herzl associated Venus, the goddess of erotic love, with a false idol, and preferred to dwell instead in the realm of chaste love, that for a pubescent girl, for example, or for his sister Pauline. Evidence to substantiate my assertion is Herzl's fascination with Richard Wagner's opera Tannhauser. He devoted a journalistic essay to it in May of 1895, just before he entered his Zionist delirium. He listened to it repeatedly while immersed in his delirious state in June of 1895, and he had the Bacchanal from Tannhauser played at the Second Zionist Congress in 1898. Historians repeatedly say it was the overture. They're wrong. It was the Bacchanal, which comes immediately after the overture and was added for the Paris performance and not in the original performance. This is because I hang out with opera nerds. Tannhauser tells the story of a man trapped by Venus in the Venusberg, the Mount of Venus, and who seeks to escape her spell for both earthly existence and the spiritual love of the chaste Elizabeth. Several scholars have written on Herzl's love of the opera, but they have tended to read it politically as an allegory on escape from the ghetto, the grotto of Venus, or the futility of assimilation. There's a petition to the Pope in the opera. But given Herzl's baggage, emotional baggage, it makes at least as much sense to read his engagement with the opera as the search for an escape from Venus. That is, an escape from his own stunted erotic life. As Zionism gave him a cause to which he could sacrifice himself completely, driving himself self-consciously, deliberately, to an early death, just as Tannhauser encounters a premature and tragic death, but also redemption. A final piece of evidence on this point is Herzl's late feuilleton called The Beloved of Venus, 1902, about a retired Roman dictator. And by the way, this is a story that Herzl, who was classically educated, based on Plutarch, the life of Sola. So Herzl was well read, but he makes interesting changes to the Latin text. He turns this retired Roman dictator, Sola, into an alter ego of Herzl himself. In the story, Sola has given up responsibility of maintaining the Roman Empire and longs for simple and earthly pleasures. What happens to him? He is killed while making love to his enemy's mistress, Venus. For Herzl, being the beloved of Venus does not lead to a good end. Many of Herzl's feuilletons are coated in sugary sentimentality that does not conceal their bitter emotional core. In one of Herzl's best short stories, Sarah Holtzman from 1896, the irretrievable girl-woman from Herzl's erotic past takes the form of a beautiful but sad-faced lass whose brassy and bejeweled mother is having an affair. The story is told by a friend of a family, a tortured and struggling artist whose love for the girl is both avuncular and romantic. In Sarah Holtzman, Herzl clearly places himself in the position of the narrator. He did the same thing 6 years later in his story, Die Brille, the reading glasses, about a man approaching middle age with weakening vision, something I'm all too familiar with. A rather blurred image of a young woman in a hotel salon reminds him of, yes, yet again, a 14-year-old girl he had loved in his youth. As a political leader and thinker, Herzl had a powerful vision for the Jewish future, but emotionally, Herzl remained fixated upon the past. Now, these writings do not tell us directly, I want to make this very clear, these writings do not tell us in and of themselves why Herzl became a Zionist. But they testify to a blocked and suffering self that cannot be accounted for solely by exogenous factors like anti-Semitism. Herzl's emotional pain does not constitute a sufficient precondition for the turn to Zionism, but two other emotions precluded alternatives to Zionism. Pride. Pride kept him from favoring mass conversion. And fear. Fear of anarchy kept him at arm's length from socialism. Herzl might have simply had a complete breakdown, but his Zionist project managed to keep it at bay until the frailties of his body overcame the weaknesses of his psyche, and he died of cardiomyopathy at the age of 44. Herzl's Zionism was linked to an overpowering sense of shame, shame that had haunted him from his youth. As a student, Herzl castigated himself for avoiding fighting a duel or for failing to keep his passion sufficiently under control. Herzl also expressed disgust with other Jews, whom he found ugly and vulgar. Scholars have routinely placed this feeling under the rubric of what's called Jewish self-hatred. This term does little to explain why certain fin de siècle Jews were so much more vulnerable than others to a storm of revulsion over alleged flaws in the Jewish character. Intriguingly, expressions of shame and its opposite, honor, about Jews rarely appear in Herzl's journalistic writings, his Feuilleton, but they are central to his Zionist writings, his diaries, and his novel, Old New Land. Perhaps it was only in writings intended explicitly for a Jewish audience that Herzl could openly confront these feelings, which were no less part of his psyche than the melancholy and yearning that suffuse his feuilletons. Herzl's writings, published, unpublished, diaries, journalistic, Zionist, the whole, are filled with heroic men possessed of noble sentiments and what Herzl frequently refers to as icy calm, self-control. These figures were projections of his own self-fashioning as psychologically exoskeletal, with a surface as hard and brilliant as his prose. In his pamphlet, Der Judenstaat, Herzl presented himself as a supremely rational human being who has not embraced Zionism as a passion, but has simply discovered it as a fact of nature. He offers a cool, apparently detached diagnosis of, and a cure for, a deadly and heretofore ineradicable Judeophobia. Herzl claims that he approaches anti-Semitism without fear or hatred, that is, without emotions, indicative of disequilibrium or turbulence. He sees in anti-Semitism elements of purported self-defense. Those are his words from the Jewish state. Emancipated Jews are well suited for commerce and the professions, and of course, they present fierce competition to socially mobile Gentiles. He presents this in a very scientific fashion. In other words, for Herzl, anti-Semitism is not irrational. It will behoove the anti-Semites to get rid of the Jews, and for this reason they will support his endeavor. Herzl writes in the Jewish state, I'm quoting, honest anti-Semites, while preserving their independence, will combine with our officials in controlling the transfer of our estates. He writes that anti-Semites will even buy shares in the economic arm of the Jewish company, the economic arm of the Zionist enterprise. The Zionists will then repay the anti-Semites' kindness by giving, and I'm quoting, every assistance to governments and parliaments in their efforts to direct the inner migration of Christian citizens to formerly Jewish properties. The only emotion that Herzl expresses in this whole text, really, is pride, which is manifested in a yearning for honor. Deeply concerned about the reputation of Europe's Jews, Herzl writes, quote, every obligation in the old country must be scrupulously fulfilled before leaving. Every just private claim originating in the abandoned countries will be heard more readily in the Jewish state than anywhere else. We shall not wait for reciprocity. We shall act purely for the sake of our own honor. And in one of the pamphlet's most famous passages, Herzl foresees the protection of the holy sites by assigning to them an extraterritorial status, such as is well known in the law of nations. Again, I'm quoting Herzl. We shall form a guard of honor about these sanctuaries, answering for the fulfillment of this duty with our existence. There's a lot of emotion behind the text, but it's kept under wraps. It's superficially objective. There's a great reservoir of urgency and sympathy underneath the straightforward presentation, and it's the combination of superficial sang-froid and underlying desperation. That's what makes the Jewish state so rhetorically effective. This emotional effect of the pamphlet can be gleaned from the reaction of Herzl's closest friend and ally in the Zionist movement, Max Nordau. I want to quote from Nordau's letter to Herzl after he read it. I have read your pamphlet twice. Highly heroic is this more than brave, indeed utterly fearless, Todeskühne auf Deutsch, recognition of the ultimate feeling which all Jews until now have borne in the deepest recesses of their soul. You must be able to empathize with me. Sie müssen es mir nachfühlen können. That I do this, that I react with such force. Now, in the years to come, Herzl would be well aware of the emotional effect he had on his followers. Although somewhat wary of the adulation he received, he knew that the success of Zionism depended upon the emotional energy of which he had become the center, his carefully cultivated appearance, his stage management of the Zionist congresses were all performative acts designed to attract the mass to the movement. Herzl himself would consistently cultivate coolness even if he was boiling inside. And boil he did. With wounded pride when shunted aside by the German emperor or Ottoman sultan, irritation and pique when confronted by obstreperous Russian Jews on any number of issues, and most notoriously disgust with Jewish assimilationists. In his notorious essay from 1897, Meucheln, Herzl employed an old German pejorative verb for the speaking of Judeo-German, inextricably linked with sharp dealing and cheating and insincerity. Transforming the verb into a proper noun, Herzl writes of Mauschel, which is the same as kike, really, in English, as a Jew without honor. He writes, no true Jew can be an anti-Zionist. Only Mauschel is one. So we've seen that Herzl Zionism was rooted in emotional distress and need, but it was expressed in a pseudo-technocratic language that connoted control over the passions. Herzl's persona combined passion and empathy on the one hand, and discipline and strength on the other. Embodied in his dark, deep-set eyes, which appeared to witness the tragic fate of the Jewish people, and in his full, dark beard, which gave him the look of an ancient Near Eastern monarch. Herzl elicited awe from and instilled pride into his supporters. And this affective circulation between the leader and the led is typical of charismatic authority. By elevating anti-Semitism into a rational ideology, Herzl hoped to defeat it. By spiriting away the irritant that lay at the ideology's source. He believed there was a rational element to anti-Semitism. We can take care of it. We'll clear it away. It'll go away. What was the reaction then? Herzl did, in fact, enjoy some success among anti-Semites, including the Hungarian politician cum journalist Ivan von Simony and the notorious French journalist Edouard Drumont. Drumont responded enthusiastically to the first Zionist Congress in 1897. For more than a decade, Drumont championed Zionism, not only because it would get the Jews out of Europe, but because Zionists were, he believed, men of honor, who wanted to construct their own land rather than leech off the wealth of others. By 1913, however, Drumont had soured on Zionism. It had given up the Herzlian goal of mass transfer of Jews to Palestine via the acquisition of an imperial charter. Drumont blamed this shift on Jewish plutocrats like Maurice de Hirsch, displaying complete ignorance of the inner sources of the transformation of Zionist methods and goals during the years following Herzl's death, as well as an insistence on forcing reality into preconceived notions about Jewish wealth and power. Since anti-Semitism was at heart not an ideology, but an emotional manifestation reflecting disequilibrium, Herzl's attempts to elevate it to a rational discourse were doomed to failure. Herzl also encountered anti-Semitism in his diplomatic activity, particularly with the German and Russian governments. The Chancellor and Foreign Secretary of Germany were cold to him, and the Kaiser, Wilhelm II, was wont to refer to Jews as kikes, killers of Christ, and socialist revolutionaries. The Russian Interior Minister, Vyacheslav Pleva, was even more scornful. British officials were less overtly anti-Semitic, and Herzl was able to win sufficient trust from the colonial and foreign secretaries to obtain an offer of territory in British East Africa. Herzl's diplomatic failures can't be attributed to anti-Semitism, however, but rather to the simple fact that in international relations, actors get what they want through threatening and bargaining. And Herzl had nothing to threaten with, and little to offer. His only bargaining chip, Jewish financial support to restructure the Ottoman debt, was not sufficiently enticing to win Ottoman imperial support for Zionism, and besides, he couldn't do it. Aside from threatening and bargaining, there is a third mechanism, though, by which international actors try to get what they want, what Oxford's Todd Hall calls emotional diplomacy. International actors signal intentions to each other through displays of official emotion, which may or may not be genuinely felt, but which can indicate or justify major changes in foreign policy. Herzl, unfortunately, never mastered emotional diplomacy. His appeals to the great powers were primarily based in imperial self-interest and a developmental imperative. Only a decade after Herzl's death, The outbreak of World War I would change the geopolitical situation drastically, giving Chaim Weizmann not only something with which to bargain and threaten, but also a basis for an emotional diplomacy with Palestine's future protector, the United Kingdom. So now we move to Chaim Weizmann. Isaiah Berlin once remarked, like many visionaries, Herzl understood issues but not human beings. Herzl, according to Berlin, certainly did not understand East European Jews, whereas Weizmann grasped their needs and articulated their views. Now, this is a rather romanticized and simplified image of both masses and leadership, and I do not wish to add to the hagiographical literature on Weizmann that presents him as an earthy folk Jew whose soulful glance and sparkling wit encapsulated the spirit of the shtetl from which he came. Weizmann was no less than Herzl, and Motti, you will tell me if I get this wrong, a flawed man, vain and insecure, prone to hypochondriasis, an absent father, and unlike Herzl, a womanizer. Herzl did understand human beings, but only their externalities. As a journalist, he could describe appearances and behaviors of people with great accuracy, but he could not penetrate their souls. Unlike Herzl, Weizmann possessed great empathy. He was sensitive to both. He was sensitive in both meanings of the term, easily hurt, but also emotionally bound with his interlocutor. Whereas Herzl seized on Zionism as a drowning man grasps a lifesaver, Weizmann evinced a confident and unreflective Zionism from childhood onward. He was a product of a traditional Eastern European Jewish society, and he had no qualms thinking about the Jews as a collective. It was merely a matter of which solution to the Jewish problem to adopt. 2 of his 12 siblings chose Bundism and communism with tragic results. As Shalom Rossabi has written, as a student in Germany, Weizmann's naive love of Zion became more analytical, more sophisticated, but he became neither an original thinker nor a polemicist. Like Herzl, Weizmann possessed the qualities of both transformational and transactional leadership. In leadership studies, the transformational leader is the charismatic inspirer of the masses. The transactional leader is the one who gets things done. And Herzl and Weizmann had both qualities. The difference, though, is that Herzl was tormented. Weizmann was merely troubled. Weizmann communicated as much via emotional signals as by direct references to raison d'etat. In his conversations with British government figures, Weizmann consistently blended the historic wrongs committed against the Jews, which evoked pity and compassion, with their antiquity, their morality, and their contributions to civilization, to elicit admiration and respect. Weizmann himself encountered complicated mixtures of anti-Semitism and philo-Semitism. At the outset of the war, Gerald Henry Fitzmaurice, former British dragoman in Constantinople, proposed that the Allies offer Palestine to the Dünme, who in his view dominated the Young Turk government. Very common belief, by the way, in Turkey to this day. If any of you have seen the television program The Last Sultan. Anyway. Only as the war wore on did these fantasies of Jewish power take the form of German Jews sabotaging their country's war effort, or American Jews pushing the United States into war, or Russian Jews keeping their country in the fighting in the wake of the March 1917 revolution. Arthur James Balfour, meeting Weizmann in December of 1914, and hearing Weizmann present a threnody, a tearful lamentation, on the Jews' legacy of suffering, was moved, and I'm quoting Weizmann, and he wrote to Ahad Am, was moved to tears. And Balfour took me by the hand and said I had illuminated for him the road followed by a great suffering nation, quoting Weizmann. 3 years later, after the issuing of the Declaration, Balfour told Lucien Wolfe that the Jews were exceedingly clever people who, in spite of their oppression, have achieved a certain success, which excited the jealousy and envy of people among whom they lived. Well aware of his own interlocutor's potential for jealousy and envy, Weizmann exploited myths of Jewish power to discredit the American ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, Henry Morgenthau, accusing him of leading, and I'm quoting Weizmann, an international ring of Jewish financiers in Hamburg, Berlin, Vienna, Paris, and New York, who plotted a German victory and both German and German Jewish ascendancy in Ottoman Palestine. Now, scholars have written at great length about the factors leading to the issuing of the Balfour Declaration. Compassion, raison d'etat, but they underestimate the significance of what Todd Hall, I mentioned him earlier, calls a particular form of emotional diplomacy. The diplomacy of sympathy. His book has three parts. There's the diplomacy of anger, the diplomacy of guilt, and the diplomacy of sympathy. To be sure, Weizmann offered international Jewish support for the British war effort. He played upon anti-Semitic overestimations of Jewish unity and Jewish power. I'm aware of this. Nor did he hide the fact that the Zionists were pursuing the support of other powers. In other words, he was bargaining and threatening, as state or state-seeking actors behave in the international arena. So what then was the added value of expressions of emotion, such as Weizmann's sorrowful renditions of Jewish history, Balfour's tears, and Balfour's denotation at the outset of the Declaration that His Majesty's government views with sympathy the establishment of a Jewish national home. In emotional diplomacy, the actors believe that their expressions of feeling will be welcomed by the interlocutor. In order to succeed, the signals must appear sincere and indicate a willingness to make significant commitment to sacrifices. Sure enough, the Declaration represented a vast commitment, in return for which Weizmann and his Zionist partners were called upon to be of equal service. Dismissing the emotional component of these negotiations does nothing to explain why that component existed in the first place. After all, why was the language even used? Why didn't the British and the Zionists simply speak in terms of naked interest or quid pro quo? The emotional signals and the tangible consequences of those signals are means of indicating sincerity, which foster agreement between state or state-seeking actors, addressing the fundamental problem that lies at the base of all international relations, the inability to fathom another actor's intentions for good or ill. I've spoken thus far of the emotional signals that Weizmann and the British elite sent each other. It is also the emotional impact of the Declaration that deserves consideration. I'll mention briefly the impact on the Jewish public. The Declaration met with exclamations of joy, but the emotion that was most commonly expressed in addition to joy was gratitude. Even organizations that had previously been lukewarm about Zionism expressed gratitude. Weizmann himself enthusiastically called the Declaration a Jewish Magna Carta, and that term was used quite widely in the Jewish world at the time. It's a striking invocation. Magna Carta was a concession of aristocratic privilege by an unpopular king to rebellious barons. Its appearance in Zionist discourse connotes feelings of not only gratitude or pride, but also dependence. Gratitude suggests a certain kind of dependence, but also confidence. Manifestations of these newfound positive emotions, fulfillment of longings, imminent expectations of fulfillment, to be more accurate, were universal in the American, not just the American Zionist world, really much of the American Jewish world just after the war. The American Jewish Congress in 1918 urges Jews to have, quote, complete unhampered independence in their land. The Congress's December 1918 call for a Jewish Commonwealth was then echoed by the Poale Zion in Philadelphia. This is also late 1918. There was a kind of cascade of gratitude to Britain and then an expectation that a Jewish state would shortly follow. Stephen S. Wise in 1919 directly compared the Zionist cause with, quote, the redemption of Belgium and the recreation of Serbia. That is, the creation of sovereign, although small and fragile, states. And this support for Zionism that had come from the British government was echoed by the American government to the point where Woodrow Wilson, in the summer of 1919, told Stephen S. Wise, have no fear, Palestine will be yours. And indeed, for many Jews, the most powerful emotional consequence of the Balfour Declaration was the setting aside of fear. The massive suffering they had endured during and after the war in the blood-soaked realm between the Baltic and Black Seas would now be redeemed by a Jewish national home. Jews would now live in a state of bodily and emotional calm. But we know that the Declaration did not staunch anti-Semitism. It intensified it. Unlike Herzl, whose diplomatic accomplishments were meager and attracted only a sidelong glance from anti-Semites, Weizmann won for the Jewish claim on Palestine the recognition of the world's mightiest empire, and it's precisely Weizmann's successes that intensified anti-Semitic reactions to Zionism, intensifying resentment over status inequity, hatred due to perceived wrongs, and despair engendered by a sense of powerlessness. In France, during the early interwar period, the far right was fiercely anti-British. Its activists saw in the Balfour Declaration proof of an Anglo-Zionist conspiracy to deprive France of what was rightfully its own. For this reason, some rightists in France praised the Zionist demand for statehood as a way of resisting the British. In Germany, which was crushed by the war and saw its territory reduced and its overseas empire stripped, Zionism received no such positive evaluations. The Nazi ideologue Alfred Rosenberg wrote in the early 1920s that the World War had been initiated by Jews in order to obtain a state in Palestine. World War I was caused by the Jews in order to get a state. And so, given that they are incapable of any of the creative or administrative labor required for a statecraft, what the Jews called a state would really be a power base for global, nefarious economic operations. On this view, there was no Anglo-Zionist conspiracy. Rather, the Jews enlisted the British as willing dupes. For a defeated people, the anti-Semitic trope of Jewish omnipotence was a discursive correlate for feelings of powerlessness. Now, intriguingly, the most sustained anti-Semitic treatment of the Balfour Declaration that really raised anti-Semitism to a fundamentally insane, yet very carefully thought out ideological system, did not come from defeated Germany, but rather from the victorious United States. And its author is probably unknown to most of the people in this room. In Israel, I might be careful. There's probably somebody who's wrote a doctoral thesis on him. William Cameron. Am I safe? No. Oh, there's a hand in the back. William Cameron, an unprepossessing dipsomaniac journalist from Hamilton, Ontario, would never have been known to history had he not left the Detroit News in 1918 to work for Henry Ford, whom he served between 1921 and 1927 as editor of the Dearborn Independent, and for whom he continued to work until 1946. Cameron was effectively Ford's spokesperson and media handler. He was an adherent, and until the early 1940s, a leader of the British Israelite movement, which avowed that the 10 lost tribes of Israel were the ancestors of the Anglo-Saxons, and that the Jews are descended from Judah, a mongrel Asiatic race. Cameron wrote all or most of the articles in the Dearborn Independent between May 1920 and March 1922 that were later collected and published under the title The International Jew. In recorded reminiscences by the Ford Oral History Project in 1952, Cameron claimed to have been disgusted by his assignment to write anti-Semitic pieces, and yet in fact he wrote the articles with great gusto. Cameron, according to one scholar, Cameron's involvement with anti-Semitism in the early 1920s was neither nominal nor reluctant. At least 3 times in the 1920s, Cameron met with the Nazi agent Kurt Lüdecke, who had been sent to the United States to mobilize support. There was no daylight between Cameron and Ford, with whom he lunched every day with Ford's son Edsel in the Ford factory private dining room. The Independent's issue of 28 May 1921 was devoted to the Balfour Declaration. It begins, when the British Army passed into Jerusalem in the memorable capture of the city in 1917, the protocols of the Elders of Zion went with them. It then goes on to explain Zionism's pernicious aspects. Quote, "There are 3 elements of danger in the situation as it exists today. The overwhelmingly predominant Bolshevik element that is being poured into Palestine. The intense, egotistic, and challenging nationalism that Zionists exhibit, even before they get a potato patch. The taste for world politics and world power, and the racial confusion that now exists in Palestine. For Cameron, Zionism serves the interests of both Jewish capital and Jewish Bolshevism, which are linked in that the former fear the latter and want to be spared its wrath. The government of Palestine, according to Cameron, is Jewish. headed by the Zionist Sir Herbert Samuel and Vladimir Jabotinsky, whom Cameron called, rather improbably, a Bolshevik. Cameron displays great sympathy for Palestinian Arabs, who he claims are being purloined, and that the Declaration's clause about protecting civil and religious rights of natives was inserted only to appease Jewish non-Zionists. This is an interesting variant of 20th century anti-Semitism, in that it does acknowledge a divide between Zionist and non-Zionist Jews. It equates Zionism with Bolshevism and non-Zionism with capitalism, and it posits a struggle between them. This typology is evocative of the Red Scare in the United States in the immediate post-war era. Like so many anti-Semites, Cameron is afraid of the Jews, and he implores Christian philo-Semites not to be mollified by the Jews' honeyed claims to be restoring their biblical homeland. He asserts that the Jews who are invading Palestine are not the Israelites of old. Cameron's critique of Zionism dovetails perfectly with his British Israelism, an assertion of Anglo-Saxon racial authenticity and antiquity. If the Red Scare was a manifestation of fear, British Israelism was an expression of an only slightly less charged emotion, anxiety over the changing ethnic makeup of the United States and loss of hegemony of the old WASP elite. In 1920, Cameron had reproduced comments from 1903 by Herzl and Nordau, in which both men had spoken of of a future world war, British imperial ascendancy in the Middle East, and a peace settlement by which Jews would obtain Palestine. Cameron implied that the Zionists had planned the war for their benefit. He didn't seem to be aware that talk of a future world war was really rather commonplace in the early 20th century. Now, intriguingly, Cameron's outlandish claims were repeated in the final text I'll look at today, a lengthy critique of the Balfour Declaration written much later, but it gets to this point about how it's the Balfour Declaration and Weizmann that transforms anti-Zionism into much more of an ideology, or anti-Semitism into much more of an ideology centered around anti-Zionism. This is also an obscure piece written by Robert John, published in the Journal of Historical Review in 1985. Now, as some of you might know, the Journal of Historical Review engages in pseudo-scholarship and Holocaust denial. It was a rather surprising venue for Robert John. He's a British lawyer and co-author with Sami Hadawi, director of the Institute for Palestine Studies, of an important book on British American and the United Nations interventions in Palestine in the first half of the 20th century. The article excuse me, is well written. It has footnotes. It takes at face value British, German, and French governmental estimations of the value of Jewish public support. Thank you. And equation of pro-Zionism with Jewish financial assistance. John claims that the war was going to come to a natural and peaceful end in 1916 had it not been for the Jews, who instigated American entry into the war. He argues that Woodrow Wilson decided to go to war several months before the German declaration of unrestricted U-boat warfare. He claims that the notorious Zimmermann telegram, which revealed a German-Mexican plot to invade the southwestern United States. Oops, a second. Is that where I am? Yes. And he claims that Jews were behind the Zimmermann telegram. Sorry about that. I mean, I won't go into great detail. It's kind of an assorted article. It claims that Louis Brandeis forced his way onto the court by bribing Woodrow Wilson with letters that Wilson had written to a mistress and so on. It goes on and on. The point is that Cameron claims that, quote, German Jewish bankers supported the Kerensky Revolution, the Menshevik Revolution, by lending funds to Russia. He claims that other Jewish financiers were supporting the Bolsheviks, and he develops this very elaborate conspiracy theory, all to suggest that the Zionists themselves were to blame for the failure of the fighting powers in World War I to come to a peace far before the war actually ended. All right. He blames, in the end, the entire conspiracy on Chaim Weizmann. Chaim Weizmann for his negotiations with the British, Chaim Weizmann for his undermining of Morgenthau's attempt to arrive at a separate peace with the Ottoman Empire. Now, of course, Weizmann must not be blamed for these anti-Semitic conspiracy theories propounded by John and 6 decades later, by John and 6 decades previously by Cameron. Both writers engage in baseless claims emanating from fear and hatred of Jews. The term anti-Semitism doesn't really work to explain this feeling. The old term Judenhass, Judeophobia, is probably much more appropriate. The account of alleged blackmail of President Wilson maintains traditions of associating Jews with criminality or sexual depravity. John did the Palestinian cause no good by raising it in a deeply flawed article in a journal that espouses Holocaust denial. So it is not surprising, albeit disheartening, as I finish up, to remark that supporters of the Palestinian cause today can, and sometimes do, repeat old anti-Semitic canards. What is more interesting and more relevant for my focus this evening is the extent to which oppressed peoples, including Palestinians, and anti-Semites of earlier times do share a certain common emotional vocabulary, consisting of feelings such as fear, resentment, hatred, and anger. I do believe that oppressed peoples, however, also engage in a display of shame, which carries greater significance than an anti-Semitic discourse, because the feeling of shame arrives when there is a bona fide act of victimization. Whereas in the case of anti-Semitism, you see very little shame. There's a lot of anger and hatred and rage. I think shame is and humiliation. I think it's a little different. Although anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic discourse are often compared, let us not forget them, that Zionist and anti-Semitic discourse are also bound together. As I said at the beginning, Zionism and anti-Semitism, being varieties of nationalism and of racism respectively, share a swath of negative emotions. Like other forms of racism, however, anti-Semitism is virtually free from positive emotions. That is, how many anti-Semites employ their arguments as expressions of love, pride, and joy? All nationalisms can be cruel and exclusionary. Zionism is no exception. But they can be inspirational and inculcate into humanity a yearning for achievement and solidarity. Perhaps it is wrong for people to love their countries, but love them they often do. Whether that love is naive, as it was for Weizmann, or sentimental, as it was for Herzl, Zionism has constructed an emotional matrix, as well as a state, that has sustained millions of Jews, not just physically, but also psychically. Anti-Semitism, too, can provide people with a sense of emotional satisfaction, in that it accounts for their personal or collective failures and limitations. But its therapeutic powers are feeble, unless and until it is stoked into a frenzy with disastrous consequences. Thank you. So.
Thank you so much, Professor Penslar. And we'll open the floor for questions.
Please. Hebrew, English, German, French. Avner, hi. Hello. How are you?
Okay, thank you for the fascinating lecture, especially concerning Herzl and Weizmann. I have two questions. First of all, I wonder whether it is enough to look at Herzl and Weizmann in order to explain the emotional power of Zionism.
Mm-hmm.
Because you look two exceptional figures, but Zionism as any national movement is a master. So you have to go to the masters.
Yeah.
And, well, no Benedict understand as well as I do, and he's talking about imagined community. Nationalism is not nothing to do with the family of ideologies, but the family of religions. And communities, we have to think about social psychology, not about the psychology of individuals. I'm talking about Couchbell and Turner, social psychology.
Yeah, yeah.
In a group and out of a group. So you have to think about this kind of emotional
Sure.
project. And second, second question, is there anything in particular about
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, look at this. Your second point, I completely agree. I mean, I wasn't arguing here for uniqueness. This is the case I'm looking at. But I think you're right. Nationalism, what is it? For my students, I define nationalism as the desire to be oppressed by one's own people. Absolutely. The first point, again, I agree with you completely. The only thing where I would disagree slightly is that we can't understand masses until we understand individuals. And I understand that in an aggregate, people can behave and do behave in ways that are different from their behavior as individuals, but we have to start with the individual. In the book that I finished, it's very much a book about a dialogic relationship between leader and led. That's why the book is called The Charismatic Leader, because charisma is a social construction, and charisma relies upon a constant interaction between the leader and the masses. The masses construct the leader. If there's no masses, there's no charisma. And charisma is very time and place specific. If Herzl were to come along today, I think he'd just be another person with Jerusalem syndrome, wandering around. Or he'd have a blog, and that would be it. So I agree completely that I use these two cases because it was a case study. But, and in many ways, Herzl is completely atypical. That is, his psychological torture is by no means normal when one looks into questions about how and why people become Zionists and what Zionism means to him. I mean, he was a very extraordinary man. So I think you're absolutely right. I mean, these are specific individuals. They do not speak for the movement as a whole. No, absolutely.
So thanks, Derek, for a great lecture. Just a classic example of how one can present a new project. I want to pick up on this last point by Abner. Both of these people are both key figures, and they're both, in particular, in the study of emotions, both male figures.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm wondering if you're thinking about, as you think about this project at its very beginning, that's a good time to talk about projects.
You said what kind of leaders, sorry?
Yeah,
Male leaders, yes.
If you thought about adding to this chapter or other chapters, female leaders, female representatives of the past, and what that does to our conceptualization of the history of emotions,
Right.
and the place of history of emotions in the Zionist return to history.
Right.
Because there's also a tension here between male Zionism, which is
Yeah.
very political and male and leader-oriented, and something.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not exactly what Abner said, but something else coming from another perspective.
Yeah.
Which should definitely, if not today, at a certain point in time, be in a study of emotions.
That's a great question, and it's hard for me to know how to answer it because, and I'm just, give a free plug for my next lecture, which is going to be a very granular study of something totally different. The name Herzl does not come up once. It's about American Jews in 1948. And I looked at, I really did a lot of archival and wide-ranging, serious historical research for that one. And there were very few female voices. Because what I'm looking at is, what I call the macherocracy within American Jewry. So rabbis, educators, activists, and you'd say, well, aren't women, women philanthropic activists, women? Yes, there are some voices, but very, very few. So what we have is Hadassah, for example. And there is a voice to Hadassah, and there is an emotional vocabulary. But, and of course, Hadassah is what sustains American Zionism in the interwar period, really. And yet, the frequency and the power and the effect of the emotional expressions, I'm not sure of, but you're absolutely right. In the book that I recently finished or published a couple of years ago about Jews and the military, when I encountered female voices, they were often of two kinds. One were Jewish female pacifists, but more often what I encountered was a kind of chauvinism, supporting the men going to the front. So again, I agree with you about looking at women's voices. It might be very much a reflection of or continuation of what I'm already finding. It might be different, but I agree with you that I need to look. Absolutely. There was a gentleman in the middle.
I would like to hear what is your take on your analysis about the present phenomenon of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism in American universities. Do you think that ignorance on the part of Jewish students
Well, that's a big question. I can just say this. There are 4,000 institutions of higher learning in the United States. And active pro-Palestinian activity happened last year in approximately 150 of them, out of 4,000. Now, I'm not a quantitative historian, but not very many. 150 out of 4,000. Also, last year, so-called pro-Israel events, that is events featuring speakers who are brought in by various Jewish groups who speak well about Israel and so forth, outnumbered so-called anti-Israel events by a factor of 3 to 1. Why do I have all these figures in my head? Because a friend of mine who used to work for the American Jewish Committee has just written a fascinating book about the debate about Israel on university campuses. He's not denying that there's a problem, but he's trying to put it into perspective. I do think that you have to also differentiate between students and the lecturers, the academic staff. You know, the overwhelming majority of American students are actually politically quite conservative, and universities like my own or the small liberal arts colleges are, again, by no means representative. Harvard itself is politically quite quiescent. There are small, as we know from the recent news, there's a certain university where there were 8 students in a chapter for, you know, right. So I'm not saying the phenomenon doesn't exist among students. It does, but it tends to be a very small minority, and they are motivated by the things that often motivate young people. It could be, obviously, a sense of ethnic or national religious attachment. It can also be strivings for social justice. Among faculty, it's a little different. And I'll just say one word, and then we can move on to the paper. But there is a big difference in universities between the vast bulk of the faculty who are not involved in this sort of discourse about Israel and a very small number who are. For example, if you look at a large university, the medical school, the business school, the professional schools in general, there's absolutely no real debate about Israel. In the Department of Political Science, ironically, I don't know of a single Department of Political Science in the United States of America or Canada where there's been any kind of debate about boycotting or Israel or whatever. Departments of International Relations, none. Isn't that ironic that political science, which is a department devoted to the study of conflict, there's never been a resolution about Israel brought up at the meetings of the International, what is it called, the ISA, International Studies Association, or the APSA, American Political Science Association. No, they're 2 different ones. One does political politics, one does IR. Where does it show up? Modern Language Association, Anthropological Association, a certain group within the humanities and the soft social sciences that represents a very small number of faculty. They write a lot, but they represent really a very small percentage of what's actually going on at the university. And I'm not denying the phenomenon. And I could talk with you some other time about the phenomenon because I have to deal with it. It's not always pleasant. But I just wouldn't. Sometimes I think people think more about the problem than it really deserves. Anyway, okay, back to the 20th century. Yeah.
I was wondering how anti-Semitism fits into this emotional entities and Zionism.
That's a great question. You know, what is it? Someone told me that I wish they would love us. Oh, I know what it was. I was talking to a colleague of mine at a certain university who taught in the German department. And I said, how do you get along with your colleagues there? And his answer was, well, they love me. And because they love me, they hate me. That is, philo-Semitism and anti-Semitism can be linked. Certainly the Zionist movement in Herzl's day appealed to a rather small but influential group of Christians who loved the Jews, but they loved the Jews in 2 very different ways. One was the evangelical Christian missionary love, which has very strong ulterior motives. The other kind of love was the sympathy for an oppressed people. So you had people like Bertha von Suttner, the peace activist, for example, who became a Zionist activist. Herzl paid for her to attend the 1899 peace conference in The Hague and so on. So philo-Semitism can mean very different things. Sometimes it's an expression of tshuva or repentance. So there was a German who had actually been in Herzl's fraternity who was an anti-Semite in his youth and then kind of repented and became a Zionist out of sort of, you know, a sense of guilt and obligation. So I think philo-Semitism, like anti-Semitism, is a very inaccurate and ineffective word to describe what might be entirely different emotional structures. And we use the single word. It's a little bit, I'm sorry to invoke the medical terminology, but of cancer, which probably refers to a great many separate forms of pathology, and we're simply imposing upon it this single word. So philo-Semitism is many different ways of approaching Jews with a certain language of affinity, but the motives can be very different. I don't know if that helps answer the questions. I don't think we can talk about anti-Semitism as a single thing, as I mentioned towards the end of my remarks today, or philo-Semitism. Yeah. Yeah.
And the second question, anti-Semitism means that you have a hatred for the Semitic people. A lot of you mentioned also in the 20th century that the rise of the Israeli state and all of that, but there is a lot of right-wing parties that are also hate the Arab and the Muslim communities, but Arabs are considered our brothers. You see the historical way. So you tell me that those right-wing parties are also anti-Semitic because they hate Arabs?
Good questions. Regarding the first one, why do we have a word for the hatred of Jews? We have a word for it because in Europe, unlike in the United States, Jews were the most, I'd say, visible, frequently targeted minority across the board. That is, within Ukraine, the Poles and Ukrainians didn't like each other, and within, Ireland is the Protestants and the Catholics or whatever. But there was this kind of continent-wide, at least, historic discomfort with Jews, which had a different word. I mean, it was called Judenhass in Germany in the early 19th century. And then in the 1870s, Wilhelm Marr popularizes this new word, anti-Semitism, which refers to an ideology, as he claims. Jews are the bearers of capitalist development. Jews are a danger to the economy, and therefore, if we marshal our forces against the Jews, we'll improve our society. And so the word simply picks up. Now, what's interesting is not just that he comes across the word, or he may have invented it, but that its popularity. And its popularity speaks for itself. Why do we have the word? We have the word because anti-Semites liked the word. There was, long before, let's say, American Jewish activists began decrying anti-Semitism, you had people in Germany who called themselves Antisemiten. And there were anti-Semitic political parties in Germany in the 1880s called the Antisemiten. So they were using the word, I'm an anti-Semite. Like today I'd say I'm a Sagittarius. I'm a Leo. Actually, I'm a Leo. Couldn't you tell? So that's why we have the word. We have the word because people invented it, and its popularity speaks for itself. As far as your other argument, your other question, look, there's no such thing as a Semite. Semitic languages exist. Languages like Arabic and Hebrew and Aramaic or whatever, they have certain things in common. The term anti-Semitic means someone who hates Jews. That's what it meant in the 1870s. It's what it meant in the 1930s. It's what it means today. Now, people can also be Islamophobic. They can be Arabophobic. They can be racist against blacks or against all sorts of communities. There's many kinds of racism and hatred. But the word anti-Semitism really refers to hatred of Jews. Mm-hmm.
Anti-Semitism and Zionism and research of the Holocaust scholar, which is another station that one could research with regard to emotional vocabulary. Zionism, there's not women, but it's there, and there's a certain emotional pedagogy that goes on for so-called push Zionists who never thought to come to what they did, and I think I could say that women learn that vocabulary, learn that vocabulary differently than men.
Yeah, those are great points. Well, as far as the first point about going beyond the great leader, please come on Sunday. Because the whole talk on Sunday is actually methodologically the opposite. In that I build up the analytical framework in a somewhat different way, and it's very much an attempt to create a kind of total social history, where I'm looking at secondary, tertiary leaders. I'm really trying to get, I've even got numbers. I get to go back to my love of economic history. And, you know, like people giving money and how much and where are they from. So I'm trying to create that social history. So thank you. The second point, you're absolutely right. I mean, there's no question it's a gendered discourse. I mean, nationalist discourse is usually gendered, very strongly gendered in the case of Zionism, centered around the body, usually the male body, although not only. And I think that the way you've put it is extremely helpful for me. So all I can say is then 2 or 3 years from now when I actually have them close to a book, I'll thank you for that. But the way you've put it in terms of women deploying gendered language in a different way, that I think is probably the most helpful way. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you. I feel like if we're going to talk about emotions in a historical context in a biographical way, we should take into consideration the developmental period of the people we're talking about, Herzl and Weizmann. He did that in Herzl's case.
Yeah.
But less so in Weizmann's case. There's 14 years difference between when Herzl was born and Weizmann was born, and I feel what the lecture might have been lacking was a history of ideas concept. As in, it's not just Weizmann read some Herzl and then he decided,
Yeah.
I have a word for what I feel.
Yeah.
This happens all over Europe and all over the world. People define this as socialist, fascist, etc. So I wonder, do you feel, is there a big significance to those 14 years between Weizmann and Herzl?
That's a great question. I think there must be a difference, but probably even more so is the difference of place. Right? I mean, it's one thing to be from Belarus, it's another thing to be from Budapest. It's a very different world. And, I mean, I had to sort of dig into this. I mean, I'm not a Weizmann expert. Motti is the Weizmann expert. I'm the Herzl expert. You and I were going to do a show together, right? You're going to go take it on the road. So I mean, look, this question of time is really important also when I look at Herzl's relationship with, whether it's Menachem with Sishkin or Ahad Ha'am or whatever, in addition to you're talking about ideas, and ideas have different fads or different valences at different times, but simple generational rivalry. Young people trying to supplant older people, young people looking up to older people, all of this happens. And in the case of Herzl, all of those people he's dealing with who he can't stand, they're all about 3 years younger than him or 3 years older. They're actually generationally pretty similar. Weizmann's 1 generation down. So you're absolutely right about looking at time, but I would also emphasize the tremendous cultural differences between the two. But frankly, I don't know as much about Weizmann as I know about Herzl. So you caught me on that. For the what, sorry? Oh, the AfD, yeah. Oh, I think the AfD, if I understand it correctly, is trying to mobilize support among Jews because this sense that they have that the common enemy is in the Muslim world and so on. Yeah. I mean, yes. I mean, the answer would be yeah, they're doing it. I mean, look, because the fact is that although some early Zionists had romantic notions of affinity and, between Jews and Arabs. Obviously, the conflict, you know much better than I do what the conflict is. And there are people from the right who can try to enlist Jews as fig leaves, as legitimization, or because they really believe that Jews have a lot of power and will be able to help them in the promotion of their cause. And there are some Jews who actually do feel this way. I guess I would just say that, I mean, Zionism can make use of anti-Semitism. Say, for example, you think we're powerful, we're going to let you think we're powerful. Zionism can also internalize anti-Semitism. For example, the anti-Semitic critique that Jews are weak, that they don't know how to fight. I mean, I wrote a whole book showing the history of Jews in diaspora armies and how many of the founders of the IDF were actually, you know, they'd been officers in various armies in Europe. Or notions that Jews are economically unproductive, sneaky, shady dealing. You can find this in Zionist ideology, which has incorporated some elements of anti-Semitism. So again, that's what I meant about them being secret sharers. But you're right that today you have this phenomenon where, at least in some cases, the far right can try to mobilize Jews. And you see some of it, you know, in the United States among the far right today, where the very far right is just unremittingly anti-Semitic. So this thing called the Daily Stormer, I've had to read all this stuff lately for a different part. The Daily Stormer, yeah, whatever it is. The Daily Stormer, and then there's also, what's his name, DavidDuke.com. He doesn't like Jews very much. As they would say in England, he's not terribly fond of the Jews, you know. But I think there is a more right-wing, kind of centrist right-wing view in the United States today that can, you know, a certain kind of Jew can be very welcome. Liberal Jews, less so. So the relationship between the two is not one of total exclusion. Absolutely. Absolutely.
The sphere between the emotions of the individual and the masses,
Yeah.
also look at groups, or smaller groups than the masses. And I think that a very interesting group to look at in this context is the Chalutzim, the Aliyah Shniya.
Yeah.
And I find it interesting that, of course, they were young people, ideological people, so you can imagine they were emotional, but when they came to Palestine, and they were working in places like Kinneret and in the Galilee, they really tried to restrict the emotions, so they say, and to לכבוש את הרגשות,
Yeah.
to sort of act as unemotional characters in order to survive the harsh conditions and so on. Do you plan
Yeah.
on looking at this?
Well, you know, it's funny. I'm trying to map out this book. I'll talk more about its structure on Sunday, but it's supposed to be a very short book. This is not like an encyclopedia. It's going to be a couple hundred pages total. So all I can, and I have to lay out existing frameworks for understanding Zionism, and then I have my 4 or 5 chapters about emotions. And what I haven't figured out yet is if I'm going to be writing about Zionism everywhere, or is it really going to be mostly about the diaspora? Because I do think that what happens within the Yishuv in the state of Israel is so different. I mean, you'll hear this on Sunday, the emotional sort of structure of American Jewry in 1948, it's very different from what's going on in the Yishuv. So I'm thinking of Boaz Neumann's great book, Land and Desire in Early Zionism, which is all about these incredibly powerful emotions. Now, the people in this room, Orit among them, who know far better than I do how and when this process of emotional sort of restraint and all of this builds up, and it's part of the Sabra kind of, you know, ideal male culture of retention and being laconic and, you know, not showing your emotions and so forth. Boaz Neumann's world, they're spilling out their emotions. They can't contain themselves, right? So the question is how and when. I think that was probably constructed a little later. So I don't know to what extent I can, in a short book like this, do everything in a very impressionistic way, or just focus on diaspora. I have to figure it out. That's what my sabbatical is for. Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you for your comments.